Della Whitmore had learned to measure her life, not in years, but in the hours she could sell. 3 jobs stitched together across the cold south side of Chicago. Mopping hospital floors past midnight, scrubbing dishes till her hands cracked, sitting beside strangers as they took their final breaths, all so her little brother Toby could have the heart surgery that might let him grow up. She was 27, thin from the meals she skipped so he could eat, a long burn scar hidden beneath her sleeve, chestnut hair always tied back, gray eyes that had forgotten how to expect anything good. She'd just sold her dead mother's wedding ring, the last thing she owned that still meant something, and handed the money to her gambling father because she couldn't stop believing people could change. So when he invited her to a restaurant she could never afford, and told her he'd finally found a way to pay for Toby's operation, she let herself hope. She didn't notice how his hands trembled as he filled her glass, didn't understand the sorrow in his eyes until the room began to blur and his broken whisper reached her just before the darkness swallowed her whole. "Forgive me, I didn't have another choice." She woke in a place that smelled of money and cruelty, a locked room beneath a mansion where desperate people were quietly turned into property, where a wealthy predator was only minutes from buying the rights to her life. And then the door opened, and a man in a charcoal suit walked in, tall and silent, gray eyes like cold steel, a faint scar across one cheekbone, a man the whole room feared, the head of a family whose name no one dared say aloud. He didn't raise a bid. He set a folder on the table and spoke 6 words that shattered everything. And no one in that room understood yet that he hadn't come to buy her. He'd come to tear the whole thing down, because a girl he couldn't save years ago still haunted every choice he made. If a story about dignity, sacrifice, and the price of being seen as human moves you, please tap like, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. Now let's go back to the night Della's whole world changed, and meet the man who bought her freedom with a single act. The first thought that touched Della wasn't fear, nor was it the question of where she was, but something small and painfully familiar. Who would take Toby to his follow-up appointment that afternoon? She tried to cling to that thought as fragments of consciousness slowly returned, because it was the only thing that still belonged to her real life, the life that smelled of antiseptic and carried the sound of the boy's soft cough whenever the weather turned cold. Her head felt as though it had been forced beneath murky water, her eyelids sealed together, and when she finally managed to open them, the ceiling above her wasn't the familiar yellow-stained surface of the cramped apartment she rented. It was a flawless expanse of white plaster bordered by delicately carved molding, with a small chandelier casting a gentle golden light that no one in her neighborhood would ever dare dream of. Della tried to sit up, and her body betrayed its own will, her arms and legs limp and useless, as though her bones had been removed and replaced with wet sand. She realized she was lying on a mattress so soft it felt unsettling, surrounded by layers of cool silk blankets, and it was that very softness that made her stomach tighten with fear, because she understood that no one paid for comfort like this without demanding a price equal to it. She looked around slowly, cautiously, like an animal waking inside an unfamiliar den. The room was spacious, with a high ceiling and walls paneled in gleaming dark wood, while a marble dressing table stood against the windowless wall. There wasn't a single opening through which she could see outside, no way to know whether it was day or night, and the absence of the sky made her shudder more violently than the cold itself. Then she looked down at herself, and her heart missed a beat. She was wearing a dress she had never seen before in her life, its soft ivory fabric slipping smoothly through her fingers, tailored with such frightening precision that it embraced her thin body as though someone had quietly memorized every curve while she lay unconscious. Her old clothes, the sweater frayed at the collar, the shoes worn down at the heels, all of it had vanished without a trace, and with them went the last feeling that she still had control over her own body. Della clenched her calloused hands around the silk, struggling to suppress the nausea rising inside her, and in that moment shattered memories came rushing back. The magnificent restaurant, the glass of water her father had poured for her, the trembling of his hand, and the final broken words he had spoken before everything sank into darkness. She wanted to believe it had only been a nightmare, but the unfamiliar silk against her skin told her it was real, cruelly real. She was dragging herself in trembling steps toward the heavy door at the far end of the room when the lock released with a dry click and the door opened inward without a sound. A woman stepped inside, tall, with blonde hair gathered into a neat bun without a single strand out of place, wearing a dark outfit so smooth and immaculate that every seam looked freshly pressed. Her face was beautiful in a cold, distant way, without expression, and her calm eyes passed over Della as though inspecting a piece of furniture that needed to be catalogued. "You're awake," the woman said, her voice even, without the slightest trace of surprise. "I'm Corinne. Come with me." Della stepped back, her spine striking the freezing edge of the stone table. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the raw dryness in her throat. "What do you want from me?" Corinne didn't answer. She merely tilted her head toward the dark hallway behind her, as though Della's resistance were nothing more than a minor inconvenience unworthy of attention. "Everything will be explained when the time comes," she said. "For now, you should conserve your strength. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be, for either of us." Della didn't move. She thought about rushing past the woman, but her legs still wouldn't hold her steady, and she knew she would fall before she ever reached the hallway. "I have to go home," she said, and her voice broke on the final word. "My little brother is waiting. He can't be left alone." For one moment, a moment so brief that she would later wonder whether she had imagined it, something moved across Corinne's expressionless face. "Your little Toby will be perfectly fine," she said lightly, then turned and walked back toward the door. Della stood frozen in place, the blood in her veins seeming to turn to ice, because throughout their entire brief conversation, she had never, not even once, spoken her brother's name. Toby's name still hung in the cold air as Corinne led her down a long corridor paved with granite, and Della followed in a dazed state, her mind spinning with the question of how this woman knew her little brother's name. She didn't dare ask anything more, because there was something in Corinne's composure that was more terrifying than any open threat. The corridor opened into a vast room shimmering with candlelight, and the first thing that struck Della was the music, a flowing classical melody drifting from a hidden corner, so gentle that it felt grotesquely out of place beside the horror tightening around her chest. Men and women in elegant clothing filled the room, holding glasses of glistening wine and speaking softly in the relaxed tones of people who had never known hunger or fear. Silk banners embroidered with golden letters hung along the walls, speaking of some charitable foundation, some fundraising gala for disadvantaged children, and the cruelty of that irony made Della's stomach twist. Because when she looked more closely, she began to understand that these refined guests hadn't come here to make donations. Scattered throughout the room, standing silently beside the walls, were other people with the same empty look in their eyes that she felt in her own, dressed in beautiful clothes that didn't belong to them, each one wearing a small tag around the wrist. Della looked down at her own wrist and saw the same tag, a stiff piece of paper printed with a cold sequence of symbols. And in that moment the truth struck her with such force that her knees nearly gave way. This wasn't a charity gala. It was a market. Those people were merchandise, and she was one of them. A voice behind her made her start and turn around. "Miss Whitmore, you're fully awake now. Wonderful." The man standing before her had the appearance of a kindly grandfather, with a round, rosy face, neatly combed silver hair, and a smile so warm that if she had met him on the street, she would have believed at once that he was a decent man. But his eyes weren't smiling. They were small, bright, and cold as two stones at the bottom of a frozen lake, studying her with the casual attention of someone appraising an object. "I'm Randall Voss," he said, extending a ringed hand that Della made no attempt to take. He didn't appear offended in the slightest. He simply withdrew his hand and smiled more broadly. "Your father is an old friend of mine, a friend who has been unfortunate in his financial decisions. I believe he explained this arrangement to you." "What arrangement?" Della blurted out, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and terror. "What have you done to me? What is this?" Voss sighed, a sigh filled with false sympathy. "Your father owes me a considerable sum, Miss Whitmore. And here, when a debt can't be paid with money, it's paid in other ways. An indenture agreement, one might call it. You'll be transferred to one of my distinguished guests, and your father's debt will be erased. Very simple, very civilized. No one has to be hurt, as long as everyone behaves sensibly." The way he spoke those savage words in the courteous tone of a polished banker made Della feel as though the entire world had tilted beneath her. She thought of her father, of his face in the restaurant, and the memory returned with brutal clarity. It hadn't been the expression of a man who had sold his daughter in exchange for relief, but the look of an animal driven into a corner, his eyes wide with a depth of fear she hadn't been able to understand at the time, his hand trembling so violently that wine had spilled onto the tablecloth. She had believed then that it was the torment of a guilty conscience. Now, standing in the middle of this human market, she began to suspect it had been something else. something far darker and more desperate. But before she could follow that thought any further, Voss lightly touched her elbow and directed her gaze toward the far end of the room. "It's time, my dear," he said gently. "There's a gentleman who's very eager to meet you." Della followed his gaze and saw a young man seated in a velvet armchair in the distant corner, a glass of wine dangling carelessly from one hand, his eyes fixed on her with a languid hunger that made her skin crawl. There was something in his lazy smile, in the way he looked at her as though she were a meal already laid before him, that made Della understand at once that this man had done terrible things to the people who had once stood where she stood now, and that if she were handed over to him, she would never see Toby again. The young man in the corner rose from the armchair, set his wineglass on a small table with the leisurely ease of someone accustomed to having everything he desired within reach, and walked toward Voss with the languid smile that had never left the corner of his mouth. "My dear Randall," he said, drawing out the words with obvious pleasure, his eyes never leaving Della, as though she were a painting he had already decided he would possess at any cost. "I've been patient all evening. This merchandise is exactly what you promised, perhaps even better. I'll pay twice the price you originally quoted, and I want the papers signed right now, before anyone else gets the foolish idea of competing with me." Voss clasped his hands together, his kindly smile widening even further, while a gleam of satisfaction appeared in those cold pebble eyes, the satisfaction of a man who had just watched his prey willingly raise its own price beyond what he had expected. "Mr. Kane is certainly a decisive man," he said. "I've always valued guests who know exactly what they want. Twice the price, then we may consider the matter settled." Della felt her knees weaken, and the entire room seemed to narrow into a dark tunnel, with the hungry face of the man named Kane waiting at the end. She was about to open her mouth and beg, even though she knew her pleas would mean no more than the cry of a fledgling surrounded by hawks, when the great door at the front of the room suddenly opened. There had been no knock, no loud disturbance to announce what was coming. The door simply swung inward, slowly and silently, yet its effect upon the room was more violent than any explosion. The classical music seemed to falter in the middle of a phrase. Every whispered conversation died at once, as though someone had closed a hand around the throat of the entire room. Wineglasses stopped in midair, suspended before lips that no longer drank. And Della, though she was drowning in her own despair, felt the atmosphere change, an invisible current of cold sweeping through the chamber and raising every hair along the back of her neck. The man who entered didn't need to speak to command attention. He was tall and powerfully built, dressed in a charcoal gray suit tailored with flawless precision, his stride unhurried yet firm, each footstep striking the granite floor with steady rhythm beneath the deadly silence that had fallen over the room. His hair was black, touched with a few strands of silver at the temples, and a faint scar crossed his left cheekbone like the remnant of a past no one dared ask him to explain. But it was his eyes that made Della hold her breath, eyes as gray as cold steel, calm and merciless, sweeping over the room with the detached authority of a man inspecting territory that belonged to him. And the strangest thing, the thing that made Della understand at once that he was unlike anyone else in that room, was the reaction of the crowd. The distinguished guests who had been laughing and speaking so comfortably only moments before now lowered their faces to avoid his gaze, while several inclined their heads in gestures of reluctant respect. Voss, who only moments earlier had ruled the entire room with his false smile, had turned pale, and beads of sweat had appeared across his rosy forehead. Kane also went still, his lazy smile disappearing, replaced by the wary look of a man who had suddenly realized he had wandered into territory that wasn't his. The man in gray walked directly toward the table where Voss stood, without sparing Kane a glance, without acknowledging anyone in the breathless crowd. He stopped before Voss, and for one long, unbearable moment, he merely looked at him in silence, a look that carried more meaning than 1,000 threats. Then he reached inside his jacket, withdrew a thick file, and placed it on the table before Voss with a slow, almost gentle gesture. "Randall," he said, and his voice wasn't loud, but deep and even, carrying through the room like a slab of ice drifting across still water. "We need to discuss a misunderstanding tonight." Voss licked his dry lips, trying to summon a smile but managing only half of one. "Mr. Barranco, what an unexpected honor. I'm afraid there must be some misunderstanding. This is a private transaction, and it's nearly complete." The man didn't answer at once. He simply rested his long fingers on the file and pushed it slightly closer to Voss, and when he finally spoke, he uttered 6 words that seemed to make the entire room collapse beneath their feet. "This debt belongs to me now." Those 6 words fell into the room like boulders dropped onto the surface of a frozen lake, and in the moment that followed, no one dared breathe too loudly. Voss blinked again and again, the false smile on his lips shattering into pieces and revealing beneath it the bloodless face of a man who had just realized the ground beneath his feet was splitting open. "Mr. Barranco," he stammered, his voice stripped of all the smooth, honeyed confidence it had carried before. "I don't understand. The Whitmore family's debt belongs in my ledgers. It has for months. There must be some mistake in the paperwork." The man in gray didn't bother answering. He merely lifted his chin slightly toward the file lying on the table, and Voss opened it with trembling fingers. Della couldn't see what was written inside, but she watched Voss's face turn grayer with every page he examined, watched his shoulders sag like a balloon slowly losing its air. Whatever was contained in that file was enough to choke every remaining objection in his throat. "Every loan, every document, every signature you hold concerning Frank Whitmore," the man said, his voice still so low, and even that it sent a chill through the room, "has now been legally transferred into my name. That means this young woman no longer has anything to do with you, or with this market of yours. I trust you're intelligent enough to understand what that means." It was then that Kane, who had remained silent until now, suddenly gathered a little courage and stepped forward. "Wait," he said, trying to force his familiar arrogance back into his voice. "I made an offer, and Voss accepted it. The transaction is settled. You can't simply walk in here and—" The man in gray turned his head slowly and looked directly into Kane's eyes. He didn't say a word or lift a finger, but that look caused Kane's sentence to die in his throat. From behind him, a broad-shouldered man in a black suit stepped forward and took his place beside him, silent as a shadow, and the man in gray tilted his head slightly in his direction. The large man took out his phone, placed a brief call, spoke a few words in a whisper that Della couldn't hear clearly, then ended the call and leaned close to say something into his employer's ear. The man in gray looked at Kane again, and this time, when he spoke, his voice was as soft as a breath yet cold enough to reach the bone. "Mr. Kane, I've just been reminded that your family's business at the harbor is passing through a particularly delicate period. It would be unfortunate if unnecessary complications arose at this precise moment. I advise you to go home and forget that you ever set foot here tonight." Kane's face went white. He opened his mouth as though he meant to argue, but the arrogance in his eyes vanished, replaced by naked fear. He stammered an apology that never fully formed, then turned sharply and almost fled from the room, while the crowd silently parted to let him pass as though avoiding someone carrying a deadly disease. Della stood there with her heart pounding, struggling to understand what had just happened. The man in gray turned back to Voss one final time. "She's coming with me," he said. "And Randall, I hope this is the last time I ever hear the name Whitmore mentioned in any ledger belonging to you." Voss bowed his head, deeply, in a gesture of submission that Della hadn't imagined a man like him was capable of making. "Yes, sir," he whispered. "Of course." The broad-shouldered man in the black suit approached Della, and when he spoke, his voice carried a strange respect, without the slightest trace of threat. "Miss, please come this way. You aren't safe here." Della hesitated, looking from the large man to the man in gray, who stood waiting in silence, and she understood that whatever following them might mean, it couldn't be worse than the fate that had nearly swallowed her whole. She allowed the man named Enzo to lead her out of the room, through the granite corridor, and into the bitter night air, where a gleaming black car waited beside the deserted street. Enzo opened the door for her, and Della climbed inside, sinking into the soft leather seat as 1,000 questions spun through her mind. The man in gray slid into the seat beside her, the door closing, with a firm click that sealed them away from the outside world, and the car began moving into the darkness. The car glided smoothly through the darkened streets, the glow of streetlights sweeping pale golden streaks across the windows, before fading once more into darkness. And inside the warm leather-lined cabin, Della sat pressed close against the door, keeping as much distance as possible between herself and the man beside her. The fear inside her had now given way to a cold and sharpened awareness, the kind of awareness people accustomed to suffering learned in order to survive, and she decided that if her fate was about to be determined once again, then at the very least she wanted to hear the truth spoken directly to her face. "What are you going to do with me?" she asked, her voice hoarse but steady. "You just paid for me. A great deal of money, I assume. No one does something like that without expecting a price in return. So just tell me plainly, what do you want from me?" The man didn't answer at once. He reached over and opened a small compartment built into the side of the car, took out a steel thermos and a white porcelain cup, then poured a steaming liquid into it. The warm scent of tea and honey spread through the cabin, a fragrance so gentle that it seemed strangely out of place in circumstances like these, and he held the cup out toward her. "You're cold," he said, his voice deep and composed. "Drink this. The sedative they used leaves a bitter taste in the throat for several hours. This will make you feel better." Della stared at the cup as though it might bite her. She thought of the last glass a man had poured for her, and her hands tightened. The man seemed to understand what had crossed her mind, because he slowly raised the cup to his own lips, took a sip, and then offered it to her again. "There's nothing in it except tea and honey," he said. "I don't make a habit of harming people. I've just gone to the trouble of removing from a place like that." She hesitated, then finally accepted the cup with trembling hands. The warmth of the porcelain seeped into her frozen fingers, and she took a cautious sip. The gentle sweetness slid down her throat, and somehow that small act of kindness made her eyes burn, because it had been a very long time since anyone had done something for her without attaching a price to it. "I still haven't heard an answer," she said softly, trying to keep her voice firm. "What did you buy me for?" The man turned his head and looked at her, and beneath the passing flicker of the streetlights, his gray eyes no longer seemed as cold as they had in that room. There was something tired in them now, something almost sorrowful. "I didn't buy you, Miss Whitmore," he said, each word clear and certain. "I don't buy human beings. I merely tore up a contract that should never have been allowed to exist. You aren't my property. You don't owe me your body, your obedience, or anything else. Tomorrow morning, when you wake up, you'll be a free woman." Della didn't know what to say. The words were so foreign that her mind couldn't seem to absorb them, and she sat in silence, gripping the cup of tea as she searched for the trap hidden beneath such kindness. "Then why?" she finally blurted out, and her voice broke. "Why me? You don't even know me. There were so many suffering people in that room, so why did you choose me? None of this makes any sense." A long silence passed between them. She saw his jaw tighten slightly, saw something move through his eyes, an old darkness, a pain he had buried somewhere deep inside himself, but he only turned to look through the window. And when he spoke, his voice closed gently, like a door being quietly shut. "Some stories can't be told in a single night," he said. "You'll understand in time, but not now." Della knew she wouldn't draw anything more from him, so she fell silent again, and as she lifted the cup to her lips, the sleeve of her silk dress slipped down, revealing the long burn scar that ran along her left forearm, the old wound she had always kept hidden from the eyes of the world. She hurriedly pulled the sleeve back into place, her cheeks burning with shame, and glanced at him, waiting for a question, a frown, or a flicker of pity. But the man asked nothing. He had seen it. She knew he had. Yet his gaze had touched the scar for only a second before moving gently away, as though allowing her to keep her secret without forcing it into the light. He didn't say a word or demand an explanation, and that respectful silence tightened Della's throat, because it was the first time in many years that someone had seen her wound without looking at her as though she were damaged, pitiful, or a burden that needed to be dealt with. The car carried them through a towering iron gate and along a long gravel drive toward an old mansion hidden behind rows of dark trees. And when Enzo brought the vehicle to a stop, the man stepped out first and waited in silence for Della to follow, his patience quiet and unhurried. He led her inside, across a vast stone-floored entrance hall, up a broad wooden staircase, and into a warm study illuminated by soft golden lamps, where bookshelves rose all the way to the ceiling and a fire crackled gently in the hearth. He invited her to sit in an armchair near the fireplace, and for a long while he simply stood with his back to her, staring into the flames as though trying to arrange the words he was about to speak. Then he crossed to the desk, pulled open a drawer, and took out a small object that he cradled in his palm as though it were the most precious thing in the world. He turned and placed a tiny bracelet in Della's hand, the kind made for a child's wrist, strung with colored beads that had faded through the years, several of them chipped along the edges. "It belonged to my younger sister," he said, his voice lowering, stripped of its usual steely composure. "Her name was Marisol." Della lifted the bracelet and felt its small weight resting in her palm, while a sorrow she couldn't quite name rose inside her chest. "What happened to her?" she asked softly. The man sat in the chair opposite her, his elbows resting on his knees and his hands clasped together, while his gaze drifted toward some distant place that only he could see. "Many years ago, When I was still young and not yet powerful enough to protect what belonged to me, he began, speaking slowly, as though every word carried its own burden. She was caught in one of the traps laid by men like Randall Voss. A debt, a false promise, a contract written in honeyed language to conceal the hell beneath it. By the time I learned where she was, by the time I found the place where they were holding her, it was already too late. Her health had been destroyed. I managed to get her out, but I couldn't bring her home. He stopped, and in the silence, Della could hear both the crackling of the fire and the beating of her own heart. She died in a stark white hospital room, he continued, his voice barely more than a whisper. I was there, but I was helpless. All I could do was sit and watch. And during those final hours, when there was nothing left for me to do except hold her hand, a nurse stayed beside her. That nurse didn't leave when the shift ended, and didn't treat my sister as though she were nothing more than a meaningless name on a chart. She brushed Marisol's hair, sang softly to her, and made sure she didn't have to die frightened and alone. I've never forgotten what that nurse did, not for a single day. Something tightened painfully inside Della's chest as she listened, a depth of compassion so powerful that tears gathered in her eyes, because she understood what it meant to sit helplessly beside the bed of someone who was dying. She understood it better than almost anyone. I'm so sorry, she said, and she meant it with all her heart. The man lifted his eyes to hers, and for the first time since meeting him, Della no longer saw the terrifying ruler before whom an entire room had bowed its head. She saw a human being carrying a wound that would never heal. That's why I do what I do, he said. I swore I would destroy every link in the chain that took my sister from me, and I always keep my word. He gently took the bracelet from her hand and returned it to the drawer as though he were placing a part of his soul back into safekeeping. When he turned toward her again, some of the steadiness had returned to his voice. Miss Whitmore, I know you still have many questions, and I know I haven't given you any reason to trust me, but there's one thing I need you to understand clearly tonight. Your little brother needs heart surgery. I know about it. And from this moment forward, you won't have to sell your body, sell every hour of your life, or kneel before anyone to pay for that operation. It will be done by the finest doctors in the finest place available. I'll take care of everything. You don't owe me a single cent, and you don't owe me anything else in exchange. Della stared at him, her lips trembling, unable to form a single word, because what he had just given her, offered with such quiet ease, as though it were something small and ordinary, was the very thing she had spent years sacrificing her blood, her tears, and her dignity for, yet had never been able to reach. Della was still struggling to find the words to answer the promise he had just made when a sudden thought tore through her mind, sending her springing from the chair with her heart pounding wildly. Toby. She had no idea how much time had passed since that fateful night at the restaurant, how long she had been unconscious, what hour it was now, or how her little brother was doing. The boy was accustomed to her working night shifts, but she had never disappeared without leaving a message, and she knew exactly how terrified his fragile young heart would become when she failed to return home. My little brother, she blurted out, her voice urgent. He doesn't know where I am. He'll be frightened to death. I have to call him, please. I need to hear his voice. I need to tell him I'm all right. The man didn't hesitate. He took a phone from inside his coat and handed it to her without a word, offering only a slight nod, and then he did something that surprised her. He rose, walked to the window at the far end of the room, and turned his back to give her some privacy. Della dialed with trembling hands, pressing the numbers she knew by heart, and after only 2 rings, an anxious child's voice came through the other end of the line. Hello? Della? Is that you? Della's throat closed at the sound of that voice, and she had to draw a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm, forcing every thread of her voice to sound as natural as possible. It's me, sweetheart, she said, astonished that she could sound so steady while her entire body was trembling. I'm sorry I didn't call sooner. Something urgent came up at work, and they needed me to leave in the middle of the night for a place far away where there wasn't any phone service. I tried to let you know, but I couldn't do it in time. Were you scared? I thought. The boy's voice faltered, and she heard him trying to swallow his tears. I thought you left me, like Dad has lately. I kept calling, but you never answered. Never, Della said, and at that very moment, a tear rolled down her cheek and fell onto the silk covering her lap. Listen to me, Toby. I will never, ever leave you. Do you understand? No matter what happens, no matter how far away I am, I will always come back to you. That's a promise. And I've never broken a promise to you, have I? She heard the boy give a small laugh through his tears, and the sound was both a comfort and a blade cutting into her heart. "No, you haven't," he said. "Della, I drew a new picture. I drew you. You're wearing a doctor's white coat, and you've got a stethoscope around your neck. And I drew you standing inside a really big, beautiful hospital. Because someday you're going to be the best doctor in the whole world. I hung it right above my bed so I can look at it every night." Della clamped one hand over her mouth to keep a sob from escaping, her shoulders shaking as tears poured down her face beyond her control, because the boy didn't know that the white coat had been taken from her long ago, that the dream he had drawn with all the innocence of his heart had collapsed into ashes, and that his sister wasn't a doctor standing inside a magnificent hospital, but a piece of merchandise who had nearly been sold in a dark room. But she didn't allow even the smallest trace of that pain to enter her voice. "The picture sounds beautiful," she whispered, her tone still warm and gentle. "I can't wait to come home and see it. Now be a good boy and go to sleep early. Remember to take all your medicine, and don't worry about me. Everything is all right. Everything is going to be better, I promise you." After soothing the boy until he agreed to go to sleep and ending the call, Della sat in silence for a long while, pressing the phone against her chest as though she still wanted to hold on to the sound of his voice. When she finally looked up, she realized the man had turned around some time before and was standing quietly in the shadows beside the window, and she understood that he had heard everything. He said nothing and showed no pity, but something had changed in his gray eyes, a new softness, a look she had never seen there before, as though for the first time he was seeing the person she truly was, seeing the weight those narrow shoulders had carried in silence for so many years without a single word of complaint. The days that followed passed like a dream. Della still didn't dare believe was real, because the man's promise hadn't been the kind of empty words she had grown so accustomed to hearing from others. Within a short time, Toby had been transferred to a hospital she had never even dared dream of, a place with bright, spotless corridors, where the doctors spoke to her with respect instead of pity, where people said her little brother's name with warmth, rather than treating him like a file that needed to be processed and forgotten. And now, on the night before the surgery that would decide the boy's fate, Della sat beside his hospital bed, her hand wrapped tightly around his small, warm fingers as she listened to each steady breath beneath the soft, dim light. Toby had been asleep for a long time, his face peaceful, and on the small table beside the bed stood the picture he had insisted on bringing with him, propped against a water pitcher so he could look at it every night. Della stared at the clumsy drawing, at the sister in a white coat standing inside a beautiful hospital, and an icy fear crept down her spine, a fear she didn't dare give a name. She had lost her mother. She had lost the dream of her life. She had lost nearly everything that had ever belonged to her. Toby was the only thing she had left, the reason her heart continued to beat, and the thought that tomorrow, when they carried him into the operating room, she might lose that too left her so breathless that she had to grip the edge of the bed to keep from collapsing. She hadn't prayed in a long time. It had been many years since she had stopped believing that anyone above was listening. But tonight, in the stillness of the hospital room, she whispered a few awkward pleas, begging for her little brother to live, begging that the last thing she had left not be taken from her. She had been sitting that way for what might have been hours, her eyes dry after crying until there were no tears left. When the door opened softly behind her, she turned and saw the man standing there, still dressed in a dark suit, holding 2 cups of steaming coffee, his face looking less severe than usual beneath the muted light. He didn't explain why he had come at such a late hour. He simply walked in, placed 1 cup of coffee on the table beside her, then pulled over a chair and sat at a respectful distance, not close enough to intrude, yet not so far away that she would feel alone. "You don't have to be here," Della said softly, her voice rough and exhausted. "You've already done more than enough." "I know," he replied, his eyes resting on the sleeping boy. "But no one should have to sit alone through a night like this." And he said nothing more. He simply remained there beside her in silence. And strangely, the silence didn't feel suffocating. Instead, it offered a kind of comfort Della couldn't explain. For so long, she had carried everything alone, staying awake by herself beside her mother's hospital bed years ago, scraping together every dollar for her brother's medicine by herself, swallowing her tears so no one would see them. Yet tonight, another human being sat beside her, asking for nothing, offering no hollow words of reassurance, simply remaining present and sharing the weight of the waiting. She glanced at him from the corner of her eye, studying the shadow of his profile cast against the wall, and realized that this man was nothing like the person she had first imagined him to be. That night in the dark room, she had seen a cold and fearsome ruler before whom an entire room trembled, a man who held the power of life and death in his hands. But now, beneath the faded hospital light, she saw a man carrying a profound loneliness inside him, a man who had once spent a sleepless night beside his own sister's hospital bed and knew exactly what it meant to watch someone he loved struggle at the fragile border between life and death. "You once sat like this too," she said, though it wasn't really a question. He gave a small nod, his eyes still fixed on the dim light overhead. "Yes," he said quietly, "and I still remember every minute of it." Della didn't answer, but she moved her chair a little closer to his, and so the two lonely souls remained beside each other through the long night, keeping watch over the small life sleeping peacefully before them, waiting for dawn and whatever it would bring. Dawn arrived, and with it came the moment Della had both longed for and dreaded, when the nurses gently wheeled Toby toward the operating room and she bent down to kiss his forehead, whispering that everything would be all right, that when he woke up she would be right there waiting for him. The boy smiled at her with the complete and trusting smile of a child who believed his sister could move mountains and hold back the sea. Then the operating room doors closed, leaving Della outside with her heart suspended between hope and fear. Those hours of waiting seemed to stretch across an entire lifetime. She paced the hallway, sat down only to rise again, and stared at the sealed doors as though her gaze might somehow pass through them. The man remained beside her the entire time, saying very little, occasionally bringing her a cup of warm water or standing silently near her whenever she needed something steady to lean on, and his unwavering presence was the only thing that kept her from breaking apart. Then at last, after what felt like an endless passage of time, the doors opened, and the chief surgeon stepped into the hallway, lowered his mask, and revealed a smile on his exhausted face. "The surgery was successful," he said, and those words were like a beam of light tearing through the darkness. "The boy's little heart is healthy now. He'll need time to recover, but he'll be all right. He'll be able to live a full life." Della's knees gave way, and had the man not caught her elbow in time, she would have collapsed. Tears poured from her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of anguish. They came from a joy so immense that her body couldn't contain it. She began to sob, trembling all over, and she didn't care that she was crying in front of him, because in that moment nothing mattered except 4 words: her little brother would live. When Toby was brought back to the recovery room and slowly began to awaken, Della was already seated beside his bed, holding his hand and waiting for the moment his eyes would open. The boy stirred, his lashes fluttered, and then his eyes slowly opened, still clouded by the medicine but searching at once for his sister's face. "Della," he murmured weakly. "Della." "I'm here, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion as she gently smoothed the damp hair from his forehead. "I'm right here. You did so well. You were braver than anyone in the whole world." Toby gave her a faint smile, his eyes shining as he looked at her, and then he asked a question that made Della's heart seem to stop. "Della," he whispered, "now that I'm better, you're still going to become a doctor, aren't you? The best doctor in the world, just like in my picture? So someday you can help other children like me, right?" Della felt as though an invisible hand had closed around her throat. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The boy's innocent question, asked with all the pure faith of a child, had touched the deepest wound she had always kept hidden, the shattered dream, the white coat that had been taken from her forever. She thought of the endless nights, of the dose of medicine that had destroyed both her career and her conscience, of the door that had closed in her face and would never open again. But when she looked into her little brother's eyes, bright with hope, she couldn't bring herself to tell him the truth and extinguish that light. She began, her voice breaking, and she swallowed her tears, forcing a smile onto her face. "I'll do everything I can, sweetheart. I promise you, I'll try." The boy was satisfied with that answer, his eyelids growing heavy once more, and before long he had fallen into a peaceful sleep, his hand still holding tightly to hers. Della lowered her head and allowed the tears she had struggled to restrain to fall in silence. And when she finally looked up through them, she saw the man standing in the doorway, quietly watching the two of them, and she knew he had heard the question, had seen the painful hesitation in her answer, and had recognized the secret she had never shared with anyone. His eyes met hers, and there was no curiosity or judgment in them, only a silent understanding, as though he had just seen a broken piece of her soul that even she was still trying to deny. That night, after Toby had fallen peacefully asleep, and the nurses had completed their final examination and left. Della stepped into the quiet hallway to catch her breath, and she saw the man standing beside the large window at the far end, looking down at the city shimmering with lights below. She came to stand beside him, and for a long while neither of them spoke, until she finally broke the silence, her voice so soft it was as though she feared waking the ghosts of the past. "You heard what he asked me," she said. "And I know you realize something was wrong with my answer." He didn't turn toward her, but he inclined his head slightly to show that he was listening. Della drew a deep breath, and then, for reasons she couldn't fully understand, perhaps because of the crushing exhaustion that had followed so many days of strain, perhaps because he had never once judged her, the words she had buried for years suddenly began to pour out. "I used to be a nurse," she began. "No, I was becoming a nurse. I studied hard, worked myself to the bone, and stood so close to the dream of my life that I could almost touch it. I was good at it. I could read thick medical charts with a single glance, catch mistakes other people overlooked, and look through a medical file and immediately know what was right, what was wrong, and what had been distorted. It was what I was born to do." She paused, and her voice sank lower. "Then my mother became ill." In a choked voice, she told him about her mother's final months, about the illness that consumed her little by little, about the pain no legally permitted dose of medicine could relieve. She told him about that final night, when her mother lay there, her wasted body twisting beneath unbearable agony, her eyes pleading with Della to do something, anything, to end the torment. "I couldn't bear to watch her suffer that way," Della whispered, as tears streamed down her face. "I was her daughter, and I was almost a nurse, and I had access to something that could help her. So I did what I wasn't allowed to do. I took medicine from the hospital, medicine that didn't belong to me, so my mother could pass without writhing in pain. She was peaceful during her final hours. She held my hand and smiled, but she still died. She wiped her tears away with the back of her hand, but they continued falling without end. They found out. Of course they found out. I lost my right to practice. My dream vanished into nothing. And worst of all, I've never stopped wondering whether I did the right thing, whether I helped her, or whether I made her go sooner. For all these years, every night, that question has haunted me. So when Toby asked whether I would still become a doctor, I couldn't tell him that his sister had lost everything, that his sister might be someone who had done something terrible. A long silence followed, broken only by the sound of her breathing and the distant murmur of the city below. Then the man turned toward her, and he looked at her not with the judgment she had feared for so long, but with a tenderness that stole her breath. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice deep and certain, "listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. What you did for your mother wasn't a crime. It was an act of love, in a moment when a human being had been driven to the furthest limits of helplessness. You gave her something no law could grant: peace, dignity in her final moments. The law may call it a mistake, but my heart, and I believe your mother's heart as well, calls it mercy." Della looked at him, her lips trembling. "But you loved her," he interrupted, gently but firmly. "Compassion is never a sin. People may take away your license, but no one can take away who you truly are. And who you are, the woman who stayed awake through endless nights beside a hospital bed, the sister who lied to protect her brother's hope, the daughter who carried that pain for years and still refused to collapse. That person is a healer, with or without a degree." And for the first time in all those years, something inside Della's chest loosened. The burden of guilt she had silently carried for so long lifting, if only a little, and she began to cry. Not from pain, but because at last someone had told her that she was allowed to forgive herself. When Toby was strong enough to leave the hospital, the man arranged for the brother and sister to stay at his mansion while the boy recovered. And although Della was hesitant at first, she eventually agreed, because she understood that it was the safest place for her little brother at that time. But Della wasn't the kind of person who could sit still and accept another person's kindness without doing anything in return. To her, such passivity was even more unbearable than the hardest labor, and after only a few days, she had already begun searching for some way to make herself useful. That opportunity came late one afternoon, when she heard a sudden commotion downstairs, and stepped out to see what was happening. One of his men, a strong young man with a heavy build, had just returned with a long wound across his arm, blood soaking through the fabric of his shirt, while the people around him fumbled helplessly, unsure of what to do. One of them wanted to call the private physician, who was very far away, while another was clumsily trying to wrap a random towel around the injury. Della didn't hesitate. The professional instinct buried within her for so many years rose at once, sweeping away every trace of uncertainty, and she stepped forward, her voice suddenly firm and commanding in a way that surprised even her. "Move aside and let me see," she said, kneeling beside the injured man. "Bring me clean water, a clean towel, and the first aid kit, if there's one in the house. Hurry." No one argued with her. There was something in her calmness and skill that made them obey without question. Della examined the wound with quick, steady hands, assessing its depth, cleaning it, stopping the bleeding, and then wrapping it neatly, all the while reassuring the man, whose face had gone pale from the pain, in a voice that was gentle but certain. "You're going to be all right," she told him. "The wound looks frightening, but it hasn't reached the tendon. You're lucky. Keep it clean and change the bandage regularly, and it should heal quickly." When she finished, the man looked at her with gratitude mixed with respect, and the others in the room did the same. They were seeing her in an entirely different way than they had before. From the corner of the room, Enzo, who always watched everything with careful suspicion, gave her a slight nod, a small gesture that carried great meaning, recognition from a man who didn't offer it easily to anyone. "You have the hands of a healer," he told her afterward, his voice deep and sincere. "Our men won't forget this." In the days that followed, Della gradually rediscovered something she had believed was lost forever, the feeling that she had value, that she was useful, that she wasn't a burden or a piece of merchandise, but a human being capable of bringing something good into the lives of others. She tended to minor injuries, paid close attention to the health of everyone in the house, and little by little, those hardened men who had known nothing but violence and suspicion began treating her with genuine respect, calling her by affectionate names, and seeking her out whenever someone felt unwell. It was during one such afternoon, while she was helping Enzo reorganize the medicine cabinet in a small room beside the study, that she happened to notice a file lying carelessly on the table, perhaps forgotten by someone. It was a medical record, and professional instinct caused her eyes to move automatically across the words written inside. She intended to look away, but something held her attention, something wrong, an irregularity that only someone who had read thousands of medical charts could have recognized. The numbers didn't match the diagnosis. The medical terminology had been misused in a subtle way, the way someone might misuse it while merely pretending to understand. The entire file, although it appeared professional and legitimate at first glance, was actually a fabrication, created by someone who wanted it to look authentic. Della frowned as an inexplicable chill crept along her spine. But before she could think it through, Enzo stepped closer, and she quickly turned her eyes away, pretending she hadn't noticed anything. She told no one about what she had discovered. But throughout that entire evening, the image of the falsified medical file kept returning to her mind, like a misplaced piece of a picture whose shape she couldn't yet recognize, while a vague instinct warned her that something far darker than its outward appearance was hidden behind it. That night, unable to sleep, Della wandered through the silent corridors of the mansion, and she began to notice something she had overlooked amid the rush of everything that had happened, the vast emptiness of the place. The house was large enough to hold an entire extended family, with dozens of rooms, grand halls hung with magnificent chandeliers, and valuable old paintings lining the walls. Yet everything was quiet, cold, and covered in the lonely atmosphere of a museum no one ever came to visit. There was no sound of children laughing, no warmth of conversation around a dinner table, no trace of a true home, only silent wealth and darkness. She found him in the study, sitting alone beside a fire that was slowly dying, a glass of untouched liquor in his hand, his eyes fixed on empty space. On the mantel, an antique brass clock ticked softly, the only sound breaking the stillness, and every so often he glanced toward it with a thoughtful expression she couldn't understand. "It belonged to my father," he said when he noticed her looking at the clock, without waiting for her to ask. "It's almost the only thing of his I kept. He left me an empire, but he never taught me how to live inside it without feeling alone." Della stepped into the room and sat in the chair across from him, and in the flickering firelight, she saw a weariness on his face that power and money couldn't conceal. "You live here alone," she said softly, not as a question. "In all these rooms, people think that once they have enough power, they'll never be lonely again," he replied, a bitter smile briefly touching his lips. "But the truth is the opposite. The greater the power, the greater the distance between you and everyone else. People fear me, obey me, need me, but no one truly sees me." It has been a very long time since anyone sat in this room simply to be with me, without wanting something in return. Della remained silent, because she understood that loneliness, understood it in her own way. Then she asked the question that had followed her for days. The question he had avoided on that first night in the car. "You still haven't told me," she said. "Why me?" "You said there would come a time when I would understand. I think that time has come." The man set down his glass, and for a long while he said nothing, as though deciding whether to open a door he had kept locked for years. Then he raised his eyes and looked directly into hers. "The night my sister died," he began, his voice turning rough. "I told you about the nurse who stayed beside her, the woman who brushed her hair, sang to her, and made sure she didn't have to die alone and afraid." Della nodded, her throat suddenly tightening with a vague premonition. "For years, I searched for that woman," he continued. "I wanted to thank her, to repay the kindness she gave my sister during the hour when the rest of the world had turned away. But by the time I found her, she was already gone. She had died after a long illness. Her name was Whitmore. She was your mother, Della." The entire world seemed to stop around her. She sat frozen, a ringing filling her ears as her mind struggled to absorb what she had just heard. "My mother," she whispered, her lips trembling uncontrollably. "She was. The nurse who stayed with your sister." "She was," he said, his voice softening beyond measure. "The woman who taught her daughter that compassion is never a sin. The woman who spent her life easing the pain of others. When I learned that her family had fallen into desperation, that your father had become trapped in Voss's web, that you were about to be sold in that vile human market, I knew I couldn't stand by and watch. I owe your mother a debt I'll never be able to repay. So my being in that room that night, Della, wasn't an accident. I had been watching over you. I came to save the daughter of the woman who brought comfort to my sister during the final moments of her life." Tears spilled from Della's eyes and ran down her cheeks, and everything that had happened over the past several days suddenly appeared beneath an entirely different light. Every act of kindness, his promise to care for Toby, all of it hadn't been pity offered to a stranger, but a thread of fate connecting two people through the goodness of someone who was no longer alive. She looked at him, and he looked back at her, and in that moment, between the dying fire and the soft chiming of the antique clock, the man feared by an entire underworld became strangely gentle, and something fragile, warm, and still without a name, quietly began to bloom between two lonely souls. Those peaceful days didn't last long, because a man like Randall Voss wasn't the kind who accepted defeat in silence, and the humiliation he had suffered that night in the darkened room had smoldered inside him like an infected wound, waiting for the moment it could erupt. His retaliation came not through bullets or blades, but through a weapon far more subtle and vicious. One morning, Enzo entered the study with his face set in grim lines, placed a stack of documents before the man, and Della, who was sitting there with him, felt the atmosphere in the room freeze at once. The police had raided the harbor, the foundation of the family's entire legitimate business operation, armed with a hastily signed search warrant and accusations constructed with such precision that they couldn't possibly have been accidental. Someone had provided information. Someone had greased the palms of corrupt officers, and now his name was being dragged into an investigation in which every possible path had already been rigged with traps. "Voss," the man said softly, the name passing through his clenched teeth like a curse. "It can only be him. He isn't strong enough to confront me directly, so he has chosen to bind my hands with the law itself, the same law he has already bought." But that was only the beginning. Later that same day, Della received a call from the hospital. The administrator's voice was confused and hesitant as he explained that the funding covering Toby's treatment and recovery monitoring had suddenly been frozen because of legal complications involving the sponsor, and that unless the matter was resolved, they feared they wouldn't be able to continue the specialized care the boy required during this delicate stage of his recovery. Della ended the call with trembling hands, her entire body turning cold. Voss didn't need to lay a finger on Toby. He only had to tighten the invisible cords of money and power, severing the fragile lifeline that held the boy's future in place. And that alone was more cruel than any direct threat could have been. He had struck at her one true weakness, at the person she loved more than her own life. "He knows," Della blurted out, her voice breaking with fear and fury. "He knows exactly where to strike to bring me down. He knows about the funding, about Toby's condition, even details that only a few people should know. How could he possibly know all of that?" The man's head snapped up, and a sharp, icy light flashed in his gray eyes. The same thought had entered both their minds at once. Voss was always one step ahead of them. He had known about Toby's funding almost as soon as it had been arranged. He knew the man's moves before they could even be carried out. No enemy could be that precise through guesswork alone. It could only happen if there were an ear, an eye, a traitor hidden within the very walls he had believed were completely secure. "There's an informant," he said, his voice so low it was chilling. "Someone within my own ranks is feeding information to Voss. That's why he is always ahead of us." Enzo clenched his fists, his face darkening with the anger of a loyal man who had been betrayed. But they had no way of knowing who the traitor was, and that suspicion moved through every corner of the house like a ghost, leaving no one able to trust the person beside them completely. That night, Della sat alone beside Toby's bed while he slept, and an old, dark thought began creeping back into her mind, the thought she had believed she had left behind. She had done this before. She had sacrificed herself before, sold away every hour of her life, surrendered everything she possessed to protect the people she loved. And now a familiar voice whispered that perhaps the only way to save Toby was to go back to Voss, surrender herself to him, and exchange her own freedom for her little brother's safety. She looked at the boy's peaceful face as he slept, then at the picture of the white coat propped beside his bed, and her heart twisted between the two choices. But this time, something inside her had changed. She remembered the words the man had spoken to her, that she was a human being with value, not a piece of merchandise to be traded, that her dignity wasn't measured by the price others placed upon it. And for the first time in her life, instead of bowing her head and accepting the sacrifice of herself like a lamb led to slaughter, Della lifted her chin, wiped away her tears, and asked herself whether there might be another path, one in which she wouldn't have to sell herself in order to save the people she loved. That other path began to reveal itself at dawn, when Della couldn't sleep and her mind kept returning to the falsified medical file she had accidentally seen days earlier, the missing piece that now seemed to fall eerily into place within the picture slowly taking shape. If Voss was using forged records, and if she, with the trained eye of someone who had once read thousands of medical charts, was one of the few people capable of recognizing the deception, then perhaps this was the path that wouldn't require her to sell herself. She went to Enzo first. Because of all the men under his command, he was the one she trusted most, and she told him about the file and the irregularities she had discovered. Enzo listened intently, and then his face darkened. "If you're right," he said in a low voice, "then those records are part of Voss's machinery, but you must be extremely careful. If there's an informant inside this house, then anyone could be watching you." Over the days that followed, Della began quietly following the trail, taking great care with every step. She used the excuse of helping organize the family's medical documents to gain access to records she normally wouldn't have been permitted to touch. And little by little, the horrifying picture became clear. She realized that the forged medical files were a crucial link in Voss's network. He used them to fabricate non-existent illnesses for his debtors, to legitimize their confinement, and to create fraudulent care agreements that were chains in disguise, turning desperate human beings into property that could be bought and sold beneath the appearance of compassion. That was why his machinery looked so clean and lawful to outsiders, and only someone trained in medicine could expose the lies so carefully concealed within every word. Della copied every detail she found, carefully recording the contradictions, the forged signatures, and every trace of fabrication, then hid them in a secure place, gradually building a body of evidence powerful enough to bring down Voss's entire shadow empire. But the work was dangerous, and one evening, while she was quietly examining a set of documents beneath the faint glow of a desk lamp in the small room beside the study, she heard soft footsteps stop directly outside the door. Her heart pounded violently as she hurriedly switched off the light, pressed herself into the darkness, and held her breath. Through the narrow opening of the partially closed door, she saw a shadowy figure standing in the hallway, whispering into a phone so quietly that the words were almost impossible to hear. But Della heard one thing clearly: a name, Voss's name, spoken in the familiar tone of someone reporting to a master. And when the figure turned slightly beneath the hallway light, Della nearly cried out, because she instantly recognized the cold face and the blonde hair arranged in a flawless bun without a single strand out of place. It was Corinne, the very woman who had led her away on the first night she awakened, the woman who had carelessly spoken Toby's name, even though Della had never revealed it. Now everything was clear. From the very beginning, Corinne had been Voss's eyes and ears, planted among them, and somehow she had managed to slip into this very house. positioning herself within the circle he had believed was impenetrable, and passing along every piece of information, every secret, and every move. That was why Voss had always known what would happen before it did. Della forced herself to remain still in the darkness, her heart beating wildly, waiting until Corinne ended the call and disappeared down the hallway before she finally dared breathe again, her entire body drenched in cold sweat. She immediately went to find Enzo and told him everything she had witnessed, and his face hardened with the fury of a loyal man who had just discovered a venomous snake hiding inside his own home. "We mustn't act recklessly," Della whispered, stopping him when she saw that he was about to rush away. "If we move against her now, Voss will know we've discovered the truth, and he'll change his entire plan. As long as she doesn't know she has been exposed, we can use that against her. We must let her continue believing she is safe while I finish gathering the evidence. This is our only chance to turn the game against him." Enzo studied her for a long moment, then gave a slight nod, his eyes filled with respect and astonishment at the composure and intelligence of the woman who, only a few weeks earlier, had been a trembling victim trapped inside a cage. "You don't only have the hands of a healer," he said softly. "You also have the mind of a warrior." And in the darkness of that small room, Della tightened her grip around the evidence, knowing that the deadly game had truly begun. And this time, she was no longer a pawn for others to move as they pleased. During the tense days that followed, Della worked tirelessly to complete her collection of evidence, and the deeper she dug, the more horrified she became by the scale of cruelty that had been disguised with such careful precision. She connected each fragment, and the full picture emerged with chilling clarity. Voss had built an entire empire upon a foundation of forged documents. He ordered his people to fabricate medical records, assigning desperate debtors mental or physical illnesses they had never possessed, then used those false diagnoses to declare them incapable of making decisions for themselves, to legalize his control over their lives, and to transform debt contracts into lawful chains that no court could easily challenge at first glance. It was a perfect network, so tightly constructed that it had survived for years without anyone being able to expose it, because to recognize the deception hidden within every medical term, every laboratory result, and every staged diagnosis, a person needed an eye properly trained in medicine, and Della suddenly understood a truth that left her both overwhelmed and shaken. The very medical knowledge she had sacrificed her career, her dignity, and years of inner torment to acquire, the very thing she had always regarded as the mark of her greatest failure and deepest guilt, had now become the only weapon capable of exposing Voss and rescuing not only Toby, but all the innocent people imprisoned in the darkness. The thing that had once destroyed her life had become the thing that could save her. But fate didn't give her enough time to complete the plan as thoroughly as she intended. One afternoon, while the man and Enzo were occupied with the investigation at the harbor, Della received a message telling her that if she wanted to save Toby's funding, she had to come to a private meeting alone. She knew it was a trap, knew it better than anyone, but she also understood that it might be her final opportunity, so she hid the evidence in a secure place, left a message for Enzo, and went. The meeting place was an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city, and when she entered, Voss was already waiting. His familiar, kindly smile spread across his round face, while his cold pebble eyes burned with anger he no longer bothered to conceal. "Such a clever girl," he said, "but sometimes being too clever becomes a curse. I know you've seen things you shouldn't have seen. Corinne tells me everything, you know. She always tells me everything." Della stood straight and didn't step back. "What are you going to do to me?" she asked, her voice so calm that it surprised even her. "Kill me? Even if you do, you won't get what you're looking for." Voss gave a quiet laugh and moved closer. "I'm a reasonable man, Miss Whitmore. I don't want violence. I only want to make you an offer. You return to work for me. You remain silent about what you've discovered. And in exchange, your little brother will receive excellent care for the rest of his life. Everyone has a price, my dear. Everyone. It's only a matter of negotiating the number." And in that instant, something inside Della burst into flame. Every year she had been dismissed, bought, and sold, and treated as nothing more than an object gathered into a blazing fire within her eyes. She looked directly into Voss's cold gaze and spoke, each word clear and final, without the slightest tremor. "You're wrong, Voss. You, my father, and your entire filthy world. You think human beings can be purchased, that every one of us has a price already written on a tag around our wrist. But you never bought me, not for a single second. And you never will." Voss's face twisted with rage. and he lunged toward her, seizing her arm as though he meant to drag her away. But Della was no longer the trembling girl trapped inside a cage. She tore herself free, shoved him backward, and in the middle of their struggle, the warehouse door burst open. The man in gray stepped inside, with Enzo and the family's men behind him, his face covered by a layer of ice more terrifying than any display of fury. He had found her message and followed the trail in time. Voss released her and retreated, his face draining of color as he realized the game had turned against him, as he understood that the prey he believed had walked into his trap was actually the one who had cast the net. The man moved forward and placed himself between Della and Voss like a fortress wall, then looked at his enemy with the eyes of someone who had waited many years for this moment. "It's over, Randall," he said quietly. "Your game is finished." Voss was subdued by the family's men and taken away. But the true battle wasn't over, because capturing a man like him wasn't enough. He had to be brought into the light of justice in a way that no amount of bribery could ever corrupt again. And that was when the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. A piece that came from the last place Della had expected. While reviewing all the documents to complete the evidence, she received an old envelope delivered through an unfamiliar attorney, who explained that he had been entrusted with giving it to her when the proper time arrived. Inside was her father's trembling handwriting. Frank Whitmore had written her a letter, and as Della read it, everything she believed about the man who had raised her was overturned once again. In the letter, he confessed everything, but not in the way she had always imagined. He explained that Voss had held him in his grasp for a long time, not only through gambling debts, but through a monstrous threat that unless he surrendered Della, both she and Toby would disappear, and neither of his children would be allowed to live. He wrote that he had fallen to his knees and begged, pleading with Voss to spare his daughter, but nothing had moved him. And in the deepest desperation of a cowardly man driven into a corner, he had made a terrible choice, sacrificing one child while clinging to the fragile and selfish belief that at least one of them might survive, that perhaps whoever acquired Della would give her a life better than death. He didn't ask her forgiveness, because he knew it was impossible, but he had done one final thing. During the years he had served as one of Voss's men, he had secretly copied and preserved evidence of his operations, names, dates, and filthy transactions, and he had left all of it to her as the belated act of repentance of a father who had forfeited the right to be called one. Della read the letter through her tears, her heart torn between an anger that couldn't be extinguished and a painful compassion for the weak, wretched man who had given her life. She didn't forgive him, and perhaps she never would, but she understood that human beings were rarely entirely monsters or entirely saints, and that even within the deepest darkness of cowardice, a distorted spark of a father's love could still remain. The evidence her father had left behind was the missing link, and when combined with the falsified medical records she had uncovered, it created a complete and undeniable case. Now came the most difficult decision of all. The man understood that if Voss was to be brought to justice cleanly, they couldn't trust the local police force he had already bought. The only path was to deliver all the evidence directly to a federal prosecutor, someone beyond Voss's reach. But doing so would open the door to a sweeping investigation, and that investigation wouldn't stop with Voss. It would expose the darker corners of his own empire as well, forcing him to lose a considerable part of everything he had spent years building. Enzo warned him of the price he would have to pay, of how much power and territory he would be forced to surrender. The man stood silently beside the window for a long time, looking down at the city that had once rested securely in the palm of his hand, then turned around with absolute resolve in his eyes. "I've spent my entire life holding on to power," he said, his voice deep and strangely calm, "and that power has never once stopped me from feeling empty. Years ago, I wasn't strong enough to save Marisol, and I swore I would never allow that to happen again. If the price of saving Della, saving Toby, and saving every innocent person Voss has imprisoned is a part of my empire, then it's the smallest price I've ever had to pay." And he did exactly that. The complete collection of evidence was delivered into the hands of the federal prosecutor, and once the machinery of justice began moving, nothing could stop it. Randall Voss's shadow empire, built upon the blood and tears of countless human beings, finally collapsed, not beneath a bullet or a blade, but beneath the weight of the truth. He was arrested, the imprisoned debtors were freed, and the vile network that had taken Marisol so many years before was shattered completely. As he watched Voss being led away beneath the flashing lights of justice, the man gently closed his eyes, and Della knew that in that moment, after all those years of torment, He had finally managed to save someone, and through that act, had begun to save himself. Many months passed after the day Randall Voss's shadow empire collapsed, and Della's life changed in ways she had never before dared to imagine. She often found herself reflecting on the strange irony of fate, how on that fateful night, her father had offered her for sale like a lifeless object, placing a price upon her life that was written on a tag around her wrist, and yet that very path through darkness had carried her to the first place where she was seen not as merchandise, a burden, or a tool, but as a complete human being, with dignity and worth of her own. One evening, when the house had grown quiet and Toby was sleeping soundly, the man came to find her, and he told her something she hadn't expected. "Della," he began, his voice deep and warm, yet touched by a hesitation rarely heard from a man like him. "You've been free since the first night I took you away from that place, and I need you to understand that this has never changed. You don't owe me anything. If you wish to leave, if you want to begin a new life somewhere far from my world, I'll make certain that you and Toby are safe and have everything you need. You have the right to choose. You've always had that right." Della looked at him for a long moment, and she understood that this was the greatest gift he could ever give her. Not money, not protection, but the freedom to decide the course of her own life, the freedom so many others had tried to tear from her hands. And it was precisely because he was willing to let her go that she finally realized she wanted to stay. Not because she felt indebted to him, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because something sincere and equal had grown between two people who had once been alone, something built upon understanding and mutual respect. "I choose to stay," she said softly, and her smile said everything her words couldn't. "But I'm staying as a free woman, standing beside you as an equal, not as someone repaying a debt. You understand that, don't you?" He smiled, a smile she had never before seen on his face, gentle and complete, and he nodded. "That's the only way I would ever want it." But Della didn't allow her life to stop there, because she had come to understand that true dignity wasn't something another person could grant. It was something one had to reclaim with one's own hands. She decided to confront the past she had spent so long running from. She went before the medical board, not to beg for special treatment or use influence to purchase back the license she had lost, but to tell the whole truth honestly, to accept responsibility for what she had done years earlier, and to begin again from the very start of the difficult road toward earning back the right to heal others. It was a long and demanding journey, filled with hardship, and there was no miracle capable of shortening it, but this time Della walked that road with her head held high, because she had learned that a person's worth wasn't determined by the mistakes they had made, but by the courage with which they rose and began again. Then one bright and beautiful afternoon, when Toby had fully recovered and was healthy, energetic, and filled with life, the boy ran toward her with a radiant face, holding a brand new picture he had just finished drawing. Della bent down to look at it, and her heart filled with an emotion too deep for words. In the drawing, there was still a sister wearing a white coat with a stethoscope around her neck, but this time she was no longer standing alone. Beside her was an entire family, a smiling little boy and a tall man standing protectively behind them, all of them together beneath the warmth of the sun. "This is you," Toby said, pointing to the woman in the white coat, his eyes shining. "You're going to be the best doctor in the whole world, just like I've always believed. And this time, you won't have to be alone anymore. We have each other now." Della pulled him tightly into her arms as tears rolled down her cheeks, but they were tears of happiness, tears from a heart that had finally found peace after enduring so many storms. And the story of Della Whitmore, the woman who had once been offered for sale like merchandise but had never allowed anyone to determine her worth, reminds us all of one simple yet profound truth, that the value of a human being can never be measured by the price others place upon them, nor by wealth, status, or the mistakes of the past, but by compassion, resilience, and the dignity within every soul that no amount of money can ever buy. It reminds us that even in the darkest hours, when the whole world seems to have turned away, kindness can still find its way from one heart to another, and a single act of compassion can change the course of an entire life. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so that every day we can continue listening together to many more meaningful and captivating stories. How do you feel about Della's story? About her journey from darkness into light, and about the man who gave her not possession, but freedom? Please leave a comment and share the feelings within your heart, because we're always grateful to hear your thoughts. We wish everyone listening to this story lasting health, a joyful and peaceful life, and days filled with love. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in our next videos.